Have you ever found yourself grappling with those really grand historical narratives, trying to figure out how societies change or, why revolutions so often seem to just devour their own?
Yeah, it's a persistent puzzle.
It really is. And today we're taking a deep dive into a work that tackles this head-on. Maurice Merleau-Ponty's Adventures of the Dialectic. It's looking at a question that feels incredibly urgent, even now. Can a revolution actually succeed without, betraying its own founding ideals?
That's the core of it.
And this isn't just us reviewing a book. It's more like a rigorous intellectual journey, really digging into how we understand history, political action, and maybe even our own capacity for freedom.
Absolutely.
Merleau-Ponty, who most people know for his amazing insights into perception, the body,
Yeah.
He found himself intensely grappling with Marxism right after the war. Post-war France.
A critical time.
Exactly. Huge political upheaval, big existential questions floating around. And he wasn't just like observing from some ivory tower. He was right there, embedded in those intellectual currents, seeing firsthand the promise, but also the failures of these big ideological systems.
And that context is crucial. So our mission today is really to follow Merleau-Ponty's own intellectual journey as he unpacks the core ideas in Adventures of the Dialectic. He's basically holding up this philosophical mirror to the 20th century, examining how these major thinkers, Hegel, Marx, Max Weber, Lukacs, Lenin, Sartre, how they all interpreted the dialectic, that intricate dance of opposing forces in history.
Right, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing, but much more complex.
Exactly. And what we'll find, I think, is Merleau-Ponty's central, really provocative insight that revolutionary movements are often, as he put it, true as movements, but false as regimes.
True as movements, false as regimes. That's powerful.
It is. And we'll see how these philosophical giants almost, unwittingly reveal this very tension as they shaped our understanding of revolution, consciousness, human freedom. And look, this isn't about us taking sides.
No, definitely not.
It's about understanding the profound insights, but also the really challenging contradictions within these historical and philosophical adventures, as Merleau-Ponty called them.
So why does this deep dive, this intellectual adventure, why does it matter to you listening today?
Well, because Merleau-Ponty's work, I think, helps us cut through a lot of the noise.
It really does.
To understand the foundational ideas that still echo in our contemporary political discussions, whether we're talking about social movements, political reforms, even the subtle ways power structures operate all around us. It's about getting that knowledge quickly, but, thoroughly. And maybe, just maybe, having a few aha moments as we connect these deep philosophical insights to our own, frankly, rapidly changing world.
So buckle up. We're diving deep into the intellectual currents that really shape how we understand history and human action. Okay, so to really get to the heart of Merleau-Ponty's Adventures of the Dialectic, we absolutely need to start with the big figures who shaped the landscape he was navigating. Hegel and Marx.
Absolutely essential. Merleau-Ponty is essentially picking up right where they left off, isn't he? Wrestling with their profound, but also, often contradictory legacies.
Yeah, right.
And what's fascinating is how Merleau-Ponty traces the roots back to Hegel first, because it really sets the stage for everything that comes after. For Hegel, you see, history isn't just random stuff happening.
Yeah.
It's this grand, purposeful journey towards realizing that truth is found in the unity of thought and being. He called this whole process the dialectic. It's like a philosophical dance, where ideas clash and evolve.
Okay, like the classic thesis, antithesis.
Sort of, but maybe richer. Think of it like this. You have a belief, a thesis. Then, boom, an opposing idea emerges, an antithesis that challenges your initial belief. And from that friction, that intellectual clash, a new, more refined understanding comes out the synthesis, which then becomes the new thesis, and the dance continues.
Okay, a continuous cycle.
Exactly. This continuous interplay where a subject encounters an object, sees it one way, then discovers its deeper nature, constantly adjusting its view. This eventually leads to what Hegel famously called absolute knowledge. It's like a spiral staircase upwards, where the subject eventually appropriates all that otherness into its own comprehensive understanding.
And the end point of all this historical climbing.
For Hegel, the culmination of this grand movement, this subject-object realization, was found in the state.
The state. Okay, so if I'm getting this right, Hegel saw the state as the ultimate, the logical endpoint of this whole historical and philosophical evolution. It's where everything just clicks into place, where reason finds its perfect expression.
Precisely. In his philosophy of right, he outlines these 3 stages of man's social existence, almost like steps on this grand journey.
What are they?
First, the intimate bonds of the family. Then you have the complex, often self-interested interactions of civil society. And finally, the comprehensive unity of the state.
Okay.
For Hegel, the state wasn't just a political structure. It was the point where the ought, what society should ideally be, actually collapses into the is what it actually becomes.
So it resolves the tension between ideal and reality.
That was the idea. Civil society, for him, was this marketplace of particular individuals, right? Everyone pursuing their own needs, their own interests. Property initially helped mediate these relations, but it also led to a division of labor and, yeah, inevitably a division of classes. But within this system, Hegel identified this unique group, the civil servants. He saw them as a universal class, supposedly elevated above all the particular self-serving interests buzzing around in civil society.
The bureaucrats as heroes.
Kind of. They were meant to mediate, ensure the common good, embody this higher rationality. For Hegel, the state was where the individual's liberty finally found its universal expression, where man's true end to live a universal, rational life was fully realized.
So opposing the state becomes irrational.
Pretty much. In this framework, any opposition became almost unthinkable. It would mean opposing the very essence of human reason and life itself. And Merleau-Ponty points out, reflecting on this, that in Hegel's view, history had basically come to a nice, serene conclusion in the Prussian state of 1827. Done deal.
Wow. That's a powerful vision, the state as history's ultimate achievement. Almost, like, perfectly logical.
Yeah.
But I can't help but wonder, for a philosopher like Merleau-Ponty, looking back, what potential dangers or contradictions might he have seen in such a conclusive, almost perfect system?
That's exactly the kind of critical question Merleau-Ponty brings to the table. Because while Hegel saw this beautiful, rational culmination, then came Marx. And Marx looked at the very same picture and saw something very, very different, something profoundly problematic. Marx fundamentally denied that the end of history had arrived in Prussia.
Hey.
He saw Hegel's universal class of civil servants not as universal at all, but as just a new bureaucracy, another layer of particular interests.
I'd love it all.
Far from it. Their dependence on government pensions, which Hegel thought freed them from economic worries, Marx argued just tied them more firmly to the dominant economic powers. They were, in Marx's view, just a reflection of civil society's particularities, not a transcendence of them. They'd become a new class needing to perpetuate itself, reliant on whoever held the economic power.
Okay, so a total inversion of Hegel's view there.
Completely. And Marx, especially in his early, really influential economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, drew this crucial distinction that deeply influenced Merleau-Ponty, the difference between man's natural being and his species being.
Natural being and species being, what's the difference?
Okay, so as a natural being, man is driven by basic biological needs, right? Hunger, shelter, survival. We never fully escape that, obviously.
Sure.
But once those fundamental needs are met, he's capable of realizing his species being, his social creative existence, his capacity for conscious production, for shaping his world, projecting himself into the future.
So not just reacting, but creating.
Exactly. Animals produce, Marx observed, but humans create intentionally, seeing themselves in their future creations. This second mode, species being, was Marx's powerful answer to what he saw as Feuerbach's problem.
Right.
Okay, you strip away God, where does humanity find its meaning?
Yeah.
Marx turned to man's labor, his creative interaction with the world and with his fellow humans as the site for this self-realization.
So this species being sounds like the core of human potential, our ability to create and connect. But then, if that's our true nature, how did Marx explain what he saw? The profound disconnect, the suffering in the society around him.
That disconnect for Marx was alienation. And it was absolutely central to his critique of capitalism. Now, Hegel had certainly described a form of alienation, an alienation of consciousness, where the subject struggles to reconcile with the otherness of the object.
And realm of thought.
Right. But Marx felt Hegel had confusingly limited it just to thought. Marx, in contrast, located alienation not just in consciousness, but in man's estrangement from nature and from himself through the very production process under capitalism.
How does that work?
Well, think about it. In a highly industrialized capitalist society, the worker often gets reduced to just an instrument, right? A cog in the machine, producing goods that are external to him.
Okay.
His labor becomes this external product, alien to him, independent of his control. Imagine like a factory worker on an assembly line, just repeating the same motion all day, making one small part of something much bigger. That component, that final product, it doesn't belong to him. His value, his very humanity, becomes strictly tied to his contribution to these external things. The more he produces, the more value he creates for someone else, the less value he himself holds, and the poorer he becomes in human terms.
So the work itself drains him.
Exactly. This labor, which should be the very act that liberates and fulfills man, allowing him to express his species being, instead deprives him of his humanity. He finds himself estranged from nature, from the products of his labor, from his fellow workers, and ultimately from himself, all at the mercy of private property and capital.
That's a really powerful description of alienation. It's like an existential loss happening right inside the economic system.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets, I think, really interesting for our discussion. Marx believed that the very depths of this alienation, this extreme misery, would somehow forge a completely new kind of consciousness.
Right, a revolutionary consciousness.
Leading to a total redemption of humanity. It's almost, I don't know, messianic in its vision. So what does this all mean for Merleau-Ponty and his core problem? How does he engage with this profound, almost redemptive claim from Marx?
This is precisely the critical juncture for Merleau-Ponty. Marx was very clear, communism wasn't just some ideal state to be established later. It was the real movement which abolishes the present state.
It's happening now.
Right, and he radically defined the proletariat as a class with radical chains, a class that is not a class of civil society, but paradoxically the dissolution of all classes.
How could it be both?
Because its suffering, for Marx, was universal, not particular. The wrong done to it was wrong in general. This class, having been stripped of all traditional status, claimed only a human status. Its emancipation, therefore, couldn't just be its own. It had to be the total redemption of humanity. And critically, this proletariat wasn't just naturally poor. Its poverty was artificially produced, resulting from the disintegration of society, deprived of its species being. Its liberation would mean the liberation of all mankind, overcoming man's one-sided existence as a mere object.
Okay, so the stakes are incredibly high.
Immense. And Merleau-Ponty, observing this whole framework, accepts Marxism as really the only philosophy that genuinely proposes a real unification of all people into a universal class, a class that transcends particular interests and aims for global human liberation.
But there's always a but.
There's the crucial, haunting question he asks. Can Marxism truly overcome the inherent barriers of violence that seem perpetually present in history? Can it arrive at this universal conception of man? Can it foster a richer intersubjectivity, genuine mutual understanding and recognition between people without resorting to the very violence it aims to transcend?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Absolutely. And this question was deeply rooted in the historical context of post-war France. Remember, the old right was totally discredited. The Communist Party had immense prestige. And these new humanistic readings of Marx, especially those early manuscripts, reinforced by fresh interpretations of Hegel from thinkers like Hippolyte, Cogé, they were sweeping through intellectual circles.
So the ideas were alive.
Very much so. The old politics of understanding, the hope of resolving social problems step by step through rational discussion that had been utterly shattered by the sheer violence beyond reason of Nazism and the occupation. Merleau-Ponty saw society crumbling, liberty gravely threatened, violence everywhere. This forced him and others to confront this stark, urgent choice between communism and Western liberalism.
That's a powerful backdrop. It really paints a picture of a philosopher deeply engaged with his incredibly tumultuous times. And it sounds like Merleau-Ponty isn't just looking at these ideas theoretically. He's really concerned with their real-world impact.
Absolutely. Merleau-Ponty operated on this basic premise. Any truly serious political philosophy must provide for its own realization. Otherwise, it's just utopian dreaming.
It has to be possible.
Right. And both communism through the Soviet Union and Western liberalism through democratic states had concrete, real-world instantiations. That made them serious contenders for actually addressing human relations. Any new description of how humans relate would also have to include the real possibility of its instantiation to even merit serious examination.
Okay.
But this posed a significant, almost agonizing dilemma for intellectuals at the time. How could they influence history? How could they lend their intellectual weight to a movement without compromising their own thought?
Yeah, the problem of dirty hands.
Exactly. How could they avoid associating themselves with institutions that, in the messy reality of power, inevitably twisted or distorted their best intentions. For instance, calling workers to join the Communist Party, when the Soviet Union's actions often looked like they served its own imperialist interests. Well, that meant endorsing an action that often refused to acknowledge certain principles or criticisms.
A real bind.
A profound tension between noble intentions and the inevitable compromises of real-world political action. This isn't just central to Merleau-Ponty's exploration, it's his core problem with the adventures of the dialectic he examines.
Okay, so before diving deeper into Marxism's internal debates and the ultimate fate of its dialectic, Merleau-Ponty makes this really fascinating and crucial detour through the work of Max Weber.
Yes, Weber, a figure often tagged as a liberal, but as Merleau-Ponty points out, not in that old-fashioned, maybe naive sense that had been so easily swept aside by the crises of the 20th century.
So a different kind of liberal.
Exactly. Merleau-Ponty sees Weber's liberalism as brand new because he courageously admitted that truth is always provisional, that it doesn't exhaust reality, and critically, that history is the natural seat of violence.
Wow, okay, so no easy optimism there.
None. Weber fundamentally challenged the idea that truth and freedom have some sort of divine right or guaranteed triumph. Instead, he saw them as something constantly achieved through struggle, through deliberate human choice.
Which is very different from...
Well, it was a stark contrast to that politics of understanding advocated by figures like Lenin. You know, the idea of resolving social problems one by one through rational, incremental discussion.
That sounds reasonable, though.
It does, but Lenin's approach had been thoroughly discredited by the sheer brutal force of Nazism. Weber, though a liberal himself, recognized the severe limits of this purely rational, incremental understanding, especially in crisis situations. He knew that understanding functions only within certain critical limits.
When things get really bad, just talking isn't enough.
Right. In times of profound upheaval, when fundamental values clash, a different kind of engagement with history was needed, one that embraces ambiguity and responsibility. And this is where Merleau-Ponty saw Weber laying some really crucial groundwork.
So for Weber, the historian isn't just a passive observer meticulously recording facts then. He's actively shaping meaning. That sounds like a very profound insight into how we actually construct our understanding of the past.
Exactly right. For Weber, the historian's role isn't simply to passively record the past, it's to construct objective truth, much like a physicist constructs an understanding of nature.
How so?
Well, when a historian examines the past, they inevitably give it meaning, right? They decide what's important, what's essential, what's accidental. They trace these vectors through the facts. And this process, Weber argued, naturally distorts the original reality where everything was just equally real. Our own interests, our present concerns, inevitably crystallize on the surface of history.
So we can't help but impose our view.
Well, Weber believed we can't avoid the historian's invasion into history because we are always already part of it. But we could ensure that historical understanding constructs meaning according to rules that assure intersubjective value.
Okay.
Through ideal types. The meanings or ideal types that a historian introduces aren't absolute keys to history. They're more like fixed guideposts. Their purpose is to help us determine the difference between what we think happened and what has actually been, and to highlight what any interpretation might have missed.
So they're tools, not answers.
Exactly. Knowledge, in this view, is never categorical or final. It's always open to revision, recognizing that the real is always beyond our partial present perspectives. It's a kind of humility in the face of history's complexity.
That makes sense.
And this leads to a crucial dualism for Weber, the past versus the present. When we contemplate the past, we can, and maybe we must, try to suspend judgment, treat it like a spectacle for us to question. The answers, in principle, can never exhaust historical reality because it exists independently of our questions.
But the present is different.
Totally different. The present is us, in a sense. It depends on our consent or refusal. Suspension of judgment is impossible here. Just waiting for things to take shape is actually an active decision to let them go their own way.
Right. Inaction is action.
Exactly. Yet, even in the present, our proximity means we can only see one side of it. Knowledge multiplies views, leading to provisional conclusions, while practice demands absolute, often partial, decisions. It's a tough spot.
It's contradictory.
It does, but despite this apparent dualism, Weber argued that history is ultimately one, whether we contemplate it or assume responsibility for it. Our relationship to history isn't just that of a spectator. We wouldn't even be spectators if we weren't somehow involved in the past. An action isn't serious unless it aims to conclude the enterprise of the past. History, as he states so powerfully, is a strange object, an object which is ourselves.
Wow. An object which is ourselves.
Yeah. Our freedom and our lives are already prefigured and compromised in other past freedoms. So Weber, then, sought a formula for this singular, perplexing situation where knowledge and action are these two inseparable poles of a single human existence.
So history isn't just out there to be observed. It's something we're always involved in, constantly influencing our understanding and our actions. And he used powerful, concrete examples to show this, didn't he? Like the surprising connection between Protestantism and the rise of capitalism. This isn't just a historical observation. It feels like it's about how meaning emerges from this intricate web of human choices and beliefs.
Indeed. Weber's analysis of the elective affinities between Protestantism and capitalism is a prime example of his methodology. He didn't claim one caused the other in a simple, linear way.
No direct cause and effect.
No. Instead, he began by abstracting two distinct historical identities. First, rational capitalistic enterprise, an economic system focused on continuous returns, careful accounting, free labor, a market economy, distinct from older forms of speculative capitalism. And for Protestantism, he focused specifically on Calvinism of the 16th and 17th centuries, viewed as a collective fact, not just its original theology. He selected these because they revealed a certain logical structure that was key to understanding other phenomena.
And he admitted this was a choice.
Absolutely. Weber was humble enough to admit the historian doesn't strictly know this at the outset. The abstraction anticipates results and is justified if it uncovers facts not initially included in the hypothesis. He saw Benjamin Franklin's work ethic, for instance, with its duty to augment capital and view that production and accumulation are in themselves holy as a kind of transition point.
Interesting.
And this ethic, he argued, was rooted in the Puritan tradition's profound belief that time is spiritually precious and that success in one's calling bears witness to the glory of God. This belief fostered worldly asceticism, a disciplined, frugal approach to life, and a broader rationalization of conduct, all highly conducive to accumulating capital.
So the religious belief created the economic behavior.
Not exactly created, more like converged with it. Weber emphasized that history doesn't work according to some predetermined teleological model. It's the advent of meaning. This meaning arises from the encounter of these elements, law, science, technology, religion, where each, in a reciprocal way, confirms an outline of rationality in the others.
Like pieces clicking together.
Something like that. For example, capitalism presupposes Western science and technology, a certain kind of law, a certain kind of government for bourgeois enterprise to thrive. To these, Protestantism contributed this distinctive, rational conduct of life. Historically, these elements might appear separately, but only their confluence creates the robust, rational, capitalistic enterprise.
So meaning emerges from the combination.
Yes. Meaning, in this sense, is like the pictorial meaning of a painting that emerges as the artist works, or the meaning of a spoken language that converges from countless verbal operations. It's a unitary web of human choices, where religious efficacy and economic efficacy are interwoven, each subtly transforming the other. History, for Weber, is profoundly meaningful, but it's not a pure development of ideas. It arises in concrete contact with contingency and human initiative.
That's a powerful understanding of how historical forces coalesce. It makes history feel less like a rigid textbook and more like a constantly evolving living story. But this very dynamic and contingent view also brings up the idea of inherent ambiguity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And what about our responsibility within that ambiguous reality?
Exactly. This dynamic contingent view leads us directly to the inherent ambiguity of history and the crucial importance of an ethic of responsibility. Weber's position navigated this profound tension. How do you preserve the unique individuality of the past while also situating it within a broader developmental process?
Yeah, that's tricky.
He faced criticism, Was he just justifying the past by understanding its phantasms, or was he judging it unfairly with present biases? Weber, however, proposed a reconciliation. Evaluative history with objective history by calling upon the past to testify concerning itself.
Letting the past speak for itself.
In a way, he believed that in most past mystifications, those involved were, to some extent, aware of the deception. Objectivity, for him, meant approaching the past with its own criteria. This allowed him to discern when, for example, religion became mystification, recognizing that even ideologies were never completely unaware of their own truth.
So we can judge the past.
Yes, we have a right to judge the past as we judge the present, because the past has, in a sense, judged itself. It introduced values that we cannot describe without either implicitly confirming or annulling them.
Okay.
Weber also offered this poignant, almost haunting critique of the future. He warned of a mechanized petrification where we'd have specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart. This nullity imagines that it has attained a level of civilization never before achieved.
Oof, that's bleak.
It is. This stark image indicates history's confused, nonlinear progression, not some smooth, triumphant march towards absolute knowledge. History, he contended, is an endless transformation of unforeseeable events, with cultural problems constantly posed anew. It doesn't just accumulate truths linearly. Projects and values shift so much that lessons are often lost between generations. His phenomenology did not lead to an absolute knowledge, like Hegel's might have. Man's freedom and the contingency of history definitively exclude the idea of a closed system.
So, lots of ambiguity, no guarantees. But what about freedom?
Despite this deep ambiguity, Weber strongly believed that freedom comprehends all the uses of freedom. The Kulturmensch, or cultural man, is uniquely endowed with the capacity to give meaning to the world, to take a position regarding its significance.
Okay.
And this ties directly into his nuanced view on the ethic of responsibility versus an ethic of ultimate ends. These, he argued, are not absolute contrasts, but supplements which only in unison constitute a genuine man, a man who can have the calling for politics.
Ethics of responsibility versus ultimate ends. What's the difference?
Okay, an ethic of ultimate ends means acting purely on conviction, on what you believe is morally right. Damn the consequences. An ethic of responsibility, however, means carefully considering the foreseeable consequences of your actions.
Head versus heart.
Sort of, but Weber saw them as needing to work together. The true politician, for Weber, possesses this crucial distance from self and mere personal success. They're devoted to a thing, Sash, that grows outside them, rather than just indulging in pure intentions or boosting their self-image. Such a politician, having consciously decided to bear the irrationality of the world, is patient or intractable when necessary, acting not from pure feelings, but from a deep rational commitment to the objective task at hand.
A very demanding view of politics.
Extremely. And what's fascinating here and really critical for Merleau-Ponty is how Weber, at a time when the Marxist dialectic was about to surge, set these rigorous conditions for a serious historical dialectic. One that acknowledges ambiguity, persistent criticism, and the necessity of creative choice, rather than relying on deterministic, preordained outcomes.
He paved the way for a more critical approach.
Precisely. He showed that a philosophy of history can't just break the circle of knowledge and reality, but must rather be a perpetual, thoughtful meditation upon that circle. His approach, with its emphasis on ideal types and elective affinities, recognized that meaning is made in the encounter of elements and human choices, not simply read from a predetermined script. This rigorous, critical, yet deeply human approach would become an essential lens through which Merleau-Ponty examined the promises and indeed the pitfalls of Marxism.
Okay, so after Weber's very nuanced liberalism, which bravely acknowledged these profound ambiguities and the limits of absolute knowledge, we turn to a very different current. The revolutionary optimism of Western Marxism, particularly George Lukacs.
Yes, Lukacs. Writing in the early 20th century, 1923 specifically, he sought this powerful synthesis that seemed to elude Weber, a way to overcome relativism and actually find an absolute truth within history itself.
Going beyond relativism by going deeper into it. How does that work?
It sounds paradoxical, right? But Lukacs, in his seminal work, History and Class Consciousness, confronted the problem of relativism not by ignoring it, but by truly going beyond it, by going further in the same direction. He recognized that our ideas, while obviously relative to our specific historical time, still possess an intrinsic truth if they're placed in their proper context and truly understood rather than just suffered as, ideological distortions.
So context reveals the truth within the relative.
Exactly. For Lukacs, history isn't just an object we passively observe, it's also our awakening as subjects, the very process through which we come to understand ourselves. The true or false consciousness we have of history is itself a historical fact, containing a mineral there to be refined, a truth to be extracted. By pushing relativism to its limits and then reinserting it into the historical process, Lukacs believed we could recover an absolute within the relative.
Okay, that's interesting.
And this perspective reveals this crucial oscillation. While consciousness is undeniably a product of history, history is also, in a very real sense, a product of consciousness, of human understanding, action, interpretation. Marx, for Lukacs, uniquely unites these two poles by making consciousness a singular sphere where all is false and all is true.
All is false and all is true.
Yeah, where what appears false on the surface might be true as a symptom of a deeper falsehood, and what appears true might be falsely presented. It's a complex, dynamic interplay.
That's a fascinating way to frame it, history, as a process of our own self-awakening. So, if history and consciousness are so intertwined, how did Lukacs see the proletariat fitting into this grand picture? Did they possess some special insight, some key to unlocking it all?
Lukacs indeed saw the proletariat as the truth of the historical whole, though critically this was primarily in intention.
In intention, what does that mean?
Well, he drew heavily on Marx's idea that the limit of capitalism is capital itself. He argued that capitalist forms eventually become regressive or decadent compared to the immensely productive forces they themselves unleash. And this is where objectification, the natural human act of pouring oneself into one's work, devolves into reification.
Reification. Can you unpack that a bit? It sounds important.
It's crucial. Okay, imagine a craftsman pouring his skill and creativity into making a beautiful piece of furniture. That's objectification. He sees himself in the object. Now, imagine a factory worker tightening the same bolt on an assembly line all day. Their labor becomes this repetitive, alienated act, and the finished product, the car, becomes an external thing that stands over them, possessing power over their life and livelihood. That product, this thing, has now reified their labor. It has taken on a life of its own, detached from and taking possession of their productive activity. Human relations start to look like relations between things.
Got it. So it drains the humanity out of the work.
Precisely. And revolution, for Lukacs, is the crucial moment when this reification is broken. When the negation, the proletariat's rejection of its alienated state, frees the truth of the entire past. It's a moment that unites the perspective that everything in the past is justified, because it led to this moment, with the perspective that everything is false until transformed. However, Lukacs warned, the path isn't straightforward. The scintillation of truth and falsity continues, even within the revolution itself.
So the proletariat holds the key, but it's complicated.
Very. And here arises a central dilemma. Is the proletariat imbued with total conscious knowledge of history, or is it merely an unconscious deterministic force pushing history along?
Right. The conscious agent versus blind force problem.
Lukacs resolves this, or tries to, by stating that the proletariat is totality only in intention, not in fully conscious intellectual thought. Its very function as a force of continuous suppression, even of itself, means it cannot exist as a compact and solid class within capitalist society, and it ceases to exist as a distinct class after the revolution.
So its existence is kind of negative.
Primarily negative, yes, often as idea in the thought of the philosopher. This suggests that the theoretician often plays a crucial role in deciphering the secret of the proletariat's existence, bringing its implicit truth to conscious articulation. It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting tension. The proletariat as an intention, rather than a fully conscious historical agent, with the philosopher playing this key role.
Yeah.
How then does Lukacs connect this intellectual insight with actual revolutionary action? How do theory and practice, the thinking and the doing, actually come together?
This complex relationship, the bridge between theory and practice, is transcended in what Lukacs called praxis.
Praxis.
For a philosophy of praxis, knowledge isn't merely the intellectual possession of a meaning or a mental object, something confined to books or academic minds. Instead, the dilemma of the theoretician versus the proletariat is overcome because proletarians can carry the meaning of history, not as I think, a purely individual intellectual act, but through active dialogue and exchange with theoreticians.
So it's a two-way street.
Exactly. Workers bring their lived, visceral experience of oppression, the daily reality of reification and alienation. Theoreticians offer information, broader historical context, a view of the total struggle. Through this dynamic confrontation, theory becomes the rigorous expression of what proletarians live, and their life experience is transposed to the level of conscious political struggle.
So they learn from each other.
Right. Marxism, in this view, avoids simplistic alternatives by considering men who explain themselves to one another, workers as speaking men, capable of adopting theoretical views, and theoreticians as living men, capable of collecting lived experience in their theses. It's a mutual transformative process.
That sounds very dynamic.
It is. And crucially, Lukacs saw Marxism's core meaning as universal criticism, and in particular, criticism of itself. Historical materialism must apply to itself, holding its own formulations as provisional and always moving toward a truth which is always to come.
Self-criticism is built in.
Fundamentally, this is a profoundly important point for Merleau-Ponty. It allows for a permanent self-criticism within the revolutionary project itself. Lukacs extended this principle to culture and literature, insisting that consciousness is never absolutely cut off from truth.
Even when it's distorted by ideology.
Yes. Instead, even when mystified, it glimpses the whole as an enigma, making permanent self-criticism possible. For Lukacs, literature expresses the relationship of classes within the social whole, embodying an intensive totality rather than simply serving as crude propaganda.
So art isn't just politics.
No. This implies a political action and a cultural action which are not always parallel. To simply reduce literature to propaganda would be to ignore that consciousness participates in truth, even if mystified, and needs to be allowed its critical function. He championed authors like Goethe, Balzac, Stendhal as models, recognizing that cultural development has its own rhythm, distinct from the immediate demands of political action, even if both ultimately converge on the historical totality.
So, Lukacs was striving to keep Marxism philosophically vibrant and self-critical, deeply integrating subjectivity without reducing it to just a side effect of material conditions. He believed in this open-ended process where truth isn't some fixed destination but a constant becoming. But he faced an uphill battle, right? This kind of nuanced, self-critical approach didn't sit well with everyone, especially those pushing for a more rigid, scientific form of Marxism.
You're absolutely right. It was a serious uphill battle. For Lukacs, the criterion for correctness of thought is without doubt reality. But reality does not exist. It becomes. And it does not become without the collaboration of thought.
Wow, say that again. Reality does not exist, it becomes.
And it does not become without the collaboration of thought. It's a profound statement. Truth is not given like a pre-written scroll, but to be made. It's not a static blueprint. It's a dynamic, ongoing process that absolutely requires human agency, active consciousness, and continuous critical thought.
So truth needs us.
In a sense, yes. Therefore, Marxism, for Lukacs, doesn't present history as a final answer, but as a permanent interrogation. It binds us to our specific time and its inherent partialities, intensifying questioning rather than ending it with dogmatic certainties. It's a genealogy of truth rather than a definitive once-and-for-all answer.
Always questioning.
Always. Knowledge, in this context, is deeply rooted in existence, where it also finds its limits. The dialectic, then, is the very life of this contradiction, a history which makes itself and which nevertheless is to be made. A meaning that is never definitively invalid but always needs rectification, needs to be taken up again and maintained against danger. It's a history reality that judges our thoughts but is itself the advent of consciousness, compelling us to engage with it actively rather than passively obey. For Lukacs, this meant Marxism, through the unique perspective of the proletariat, focused on a principle of universal strife, intensifying human questioning instead of silencing it with predetermined answers. This spirit of open-ended criticism is precisely what Merleau-Ponty found so compelling and ultimately so tragic in Lukacs.
Okay, so Lukacs's vibrant, self-critical Marxism was met with pretty strong opposition from the orthodox Marxist-Leninists. They saw his nuanced philosophical approach with all its emphasis on consciousness and self-criticism as a dangerous deviation from, true Marxism.
Oh, absolutely. Dangerous idealism, they called it.
Right. So what was their main point of contention, and how did this orthodoxy fundamentally reshape the understanding of the dialectic itself?
Well, the orthodoxy, particularly as expressed in Articles and Pravda, vehemently rejected Lukacs' so-called idealism. They lumped him in with others seen as revising or watering down Marxism, and the main philosophical cudgel used against him came through Lenin's philosophical books, most notably Materialism and Empirio-Criticism.
Okay, that became the key text.
It became the foundational text for a very rigid Marxism of antitheses, fundamentally opposing the more synthetic German language philosophical approach of Lukacs. Their main argument revolved around the very nature of knowledge and its relationship to objective reality.
The classic epistemology question.
Exactly. Lenin's gnoseological question, inquiring into the relationship between being and thought, led him back to a pre-Hegelian understanding, a much simpler, more direct view of knowledge.
How simple?
He saw thought as basically a reflection or an image produced by the brain in external reality, almost like a camera just taking a picture of the world out there.
Like a mirror.
Pretty much. This approach from Merleau-Ponty represents a new dogmatism because it places the knowing subject, or in political terms, the party leadership, effectively outside the fabric of history. It grants them access to absolute being, a direct, unmediated grasp of objective truth.
So they know best because they see reality directly.
That's the implication. And this, Merleau-Ponty argued, effectively releases Marxism from the duty of self-criticism. It exempts it from applying its own principles to itself. It embalms the dialectic in an external reality, transforming history, which should be understood as dynamic relationships between people, into a second nature. Opaque, deterministic, fixed like the laws of physics.
Wow, embalms the dialectic. That's a strong phrase.
It is. And Merleau-Ponty saw this as the source of what he called communist eclecticism, a thought without candor, an unstable mix of Hegelianism and scientism that ultimately paralyzed genuine critical inquiry and self-reflection within the movement.
So this isn't just some abstract philosophical debate. It has profound implications for how the party sees itself and its role. It sounds like a major shift from dynamic self-critical philosophy to a much more rigid scientific framework. How did this impact the party and the broader revolutionary movement, moving away from genuine comprehension towards something much more instrumental?
Oh, this shift had deep systemic implications. Merleau-Ponty points out that this discordancy between naive realism and dialectical inspiration wasn't entirely new. You can even find hints of it in Marx himself.
Really? Even in Marx?
Yeah. The pre-1850 Marx, the younger Marx, seemed to want to integrate philosophy into practice, wanting the subjective to pass into the objective, to genuinely transform consciousness. But after 1850, you see scientific socialism emerging, which rather than realizing philosophy seemed aimed at destroying it.
Getting rid of philosophy.
Or at least reducing its role. Engels, for instance, in his later work, Ludwig Feuerbach, famously declared philosophy as superfluous as it is impossible in its old sense. In this new scientific framework, the dialectic stopped being a paradoxical mode of thought or a living relationship between the thinker and their object. It became a simple verification of certain descriptive features of history, even of nature, things like interactions, qualitative leaps, contradictions.
Just laws of history, like laws of physics.
Pretty much. Philosophy was relegated to being just a particular science of thought. And Marx's Dialectic and Capital became, in this view, the affirmative recognition of the existing state of things. Essentially, a description rather than a dynamic, self-critical, transformative process.
Okay, so what did this mean in practice?
Well, on the theoretical plane, it meant a profound closing off of comprehension. That rich intersubjective understanding of history where consciousness and reality mutually shape each other was replaced by a dogmatic adherence to a supposedly objective external reality.
And on the plane of action.
It meant replacing total praxis, that integrated theory and practice of the proletariat, with a technician-made action. And the proletariat itself was effectively replaced by the professional revolutionary.
The expert takes over.
Exactly. The entire movement of history and knowledge became concentrated in an apparatus, the party. And this structure allowed for very little internal criticism because the knowing subject, the party leadership, was assumed to have direct access to absolute truth, effectively placing it outside the historical process it claimed to embody.
That's a significant move, really concentrating all authority and knowledge within the party leadership. And what about Lukacs himself, the champion of that more open, self-critical Marxism? Did he manage to resist this hardening of the dialectic? Where did he end up?
Lukacs. It's a complex and, frankly, poignant story. His intellectual career after 1923 really illustrates the immense difficulty of maintaining that balance between dialectical and metaphysical materialism under the pressure of the orthodoxy.
He had to compromise.
He did make concessions. He later admitted that his earlier dialectic in history and class consciousness was perhaps too supple, that it did not translate the opacity or at least the density of real history. He came to appreciate Lenin's emphasis on the objective world's weight, acknowledging the long work which is necessary in order to bring history to express what is, nevertheless, its meaning. He even started to speak of consciousness as a reflection of a dialectic unrolling itself objectively in men's lives.
So adopting Lenin's language.
To some extent, yes. However, Merleau-Ponty questions whether this return to naive realism was ever a genuine philosophical solution. He warned that, taken literally, this Gnosticism, this claim to direct absolute knowledge, makes all philosophical rigor impossible and ultimately just leads to skepticism. Because if consciousness is merely a reflection of some opaque second nature, it lacks any internal criterion to distinguish genuine knowledge from mere ideology. How do you know your reflection is accurate? It can only escape skepticism, Merleau-Ponty argues, through an unmotivated compliance with an external urgency like the party's dictates. You just have to trust the party line.
Fictive or reason.
Essentially. But despite these intellectual concessions, Lukacs, to his credit, persisted in defending the autonomy of truth, the possibility of reflection, the life of subjectivity, and the order of culture. He still believed literature should be judged by intrinsic criteria, not solely political ones, because consciousness, even when mystified by ideology, always glimpses the whole as an enigma, and thus contains the possibility of permanent self-criticism. He still thought truth and ideologies if they were properly placed in their social context.
So he didn't completely give up his original insights.
No, but the fundamental conflict between the dialectic with its internal criticism and dynamic process, and realism with its demand for objective verification and absolute truth, that remained not overcome with an official communism. Merleau-Ponty concluded that while communism paid lip service to the dialectic, it ultimately disarms it by denying the subject's judgment of history and the intrinsic appreciation of culture. It kept the dialectic as a kind of point of honor, justification, and ideology, while something else is being done in the shadow. It was ultimately a theoretical defeat that had devastating practical consequences.
Okay, so if Lenin's orthodoxy effectively embalmed the dialectic, turning it into this rigid scientific framework, what about someone like Leon Trotsky? He was a revolutionary through and through, a man of action, the theorist of permanent revolution. How did he grapple with the inherent violence and contradictions of revolutionary politics and that perennial dilemma of means versus ends?
That's a crucial question because Trotsky's life and thought offer a really stark contrast, but also an equally profound set of dilemmas for Merleau-Ponty to unpack. Trotsky, as Merleau-Ponty examines him, offered this concept of revolutionary realism. He was trying to navigate a perilous middle ground between sheer cynicism, by all means necessary, and what he called Pharisaism, which meant demanding pure means to the point of essentially doing nothing.
The paralysis of purity.
Exactly. Trotsky argued that a revolutionary politics is completely in the world, meaning it has to take its share of the violence of things. Each act, he believed, should be considered only as a moment of the whole, part of a larger evolving strategy. It would be absurd, he thought, to demand of each individual means its own moral tag.
So the ends justify the means.
Not quite so simply, because Trotsky also crucially stated, not all means are permissible. The great revolutionary end, he insisted, spurns those base means in ways which set one part of the working class against other parts, or attempt to make the masses happy without their participation. Ah, okay. So there are limits.
Yes, critical ethical constraints. The means employed must align with the ultimate goal of working class emancipation and self-activity. They have to foster unity and consciousness, not division or just passive acceptance.
And there was more to it than just results, right?
Absolutely. Crucially, for Trotsky, revolutionary realism never aimed at external results alone. It sought a result that was comprehensible to the masses. Because if it wasn't understandable, there could be no true revolution, only a coup d'etat.
Action is teaching.
Precisely. He believed that each revolutionary act is efficacious not only through what it does, but through what it gives people to think about. Action is the pedagogy of the masses. And explaining one's actions to the masses was, in itself, acting again. This highlights the profound importance he placed on consciousness, active participation, and education in the revolutionary process.
That's a very different feel from the Leninist model. It is. Furthermore, he held this unwavering, almost absolute belief that the party embodies in his consciousness the very highest tasks and aims of mankind. He saw no contradiction between personal morality and the interests of the party, because the party was considered the indispensable instrument for the revolutionary reconstruction of society, including its morality.
The party is everything.
For him, yes. This deep, almost mystical conviction in the party's singular elevated role, well, that would become a central and ultimately tragic paradox in his own life.
That's a fascinating, almost idealist view of the party's role embodying humanity's highest aims. But you mentioned a paradox. He believed the party was everything, yet he also saw the party betraying its own ideals under Stalin. This sounds like an absolutely impossible situation for a dialectician, caught between absolute loyalty and a growing awareness of fundamental falsehoods.
It was a profound, almost agonizing contradiction for Trotsky, one that Merleau-Ponty dissects with incredible care. Despite his crystal-clear theses on the dangers of bureaucratization and the need for internal party democracy, his actions between 1923 and 1927 showed significant hesitation to openly challenge Stalin.
He held back.
He did. He limited himself to Politburo polemics. He famously hid Lenin's testament, which contained Lenin's explicit warning against Stalin, and he declared no programmatic difference with the Stalinist majority, even as he privately harbored these grave doubts.
Why? Why hesitate if he saw the danger?
Well, the materialistic dialectic, as he understood it, didn't easily allow for the party itself to abandon the elaboration of truth through the confrontation of the de facto proletariat. In his framework, if truth resided anywhere, it was within the inner life of the party, which was supposedly created by the proletariat.
So truth had to be in the party.
That was the bind. If he denounced the party's discipline, he risked being seen as playing into degeneration, aiding the counter-revolution. If he stayed silent, he allowed the truth, as he saw it, to be falsified. He hesitated to situate truth outside the party, believing, as a materialist dialectician, that truth had to reside within the party structure itself.
So his own philosophy trapped him.
It left him without a clear philosophical procedure to counter the party's deviations, caught between a revolutionary discipline that was betraying its principles and the philosophical impossibility of declaring truth to be elsewhere. His dialectic became a cage.
Wow.
And Merleau-Ponty argues that Trotsky's profound insight was ultimately clouded by Bolshevik practices that he himself had helped establish or at least tolerate. Centralization, the preponderance of professional revolutionaries, a subtle contempt for democracy. These traits were accentuated during their time in power and contradicted the ideals of proletarian spontaneity and critical discourse.
And then there was the whole issue of Russia itself.
Exactly. A key historical challenge was that the Russian Revolution, famously defined by Lenin as Soviets plus electrification, occurred in a backward country without a mature industrialized proletariat. Trotsky was among the first to really acknowledge this unforeseen condition.
What did that lead to?
It led to his idea of permanent revolution. This suggested that a proletarian revolution could be imminent in a society which itself did not plan this revolution. It wasn't a natural outgrowth, it was a cross-growth, an internal mechanism leading beyond the average objective conditions.
So jumping ahead of history.
In a sense, this meant revolution wasn't a maturation of ripe social conditions, but a wrenching forth and a recreation, possessing an essential prematureness. The revolution, in this view, effectively created society, rather than being naturally hatched by a mature one.
This is a critical point. If the revolution doesn't arise organically from ripe objective conditions, but from this forced cross-growth, this kind of political acceleration, then its claims to being a truly universal outcome, the definitive end of history, they start to unravel, don't they? It suggests a disconnect between the ideal and the reality, pushing the dialectic into a paradoxical space where it relies on pure will rather than historical inevitability.
Precisely. And Merleau-Ponty further argues that Trotsky's unconditional defense of the USSR as the country of collectivization and of planning, even amidst the horrors of Stalinist atrocities, showed a fetishism toward economic categories. It was similar, Merleau-Ponty thought, to his earlier fetishism toward political forms like the party.
Fetishism of the economy.
Yeah. Marxism, Merleau-Ponty contends, by not conceptually separating collectivization and planning from the proletariat's actual power, lacked a critical criterion when faced with a regime, Stalin's regime, that had clearly separated these two elements of socialism. The economy was collectivized, but the proletariat held no power.
So the theory couldn't account for the reality.
It struggled. The equivocalness, the fundamental ambiguity lay not just in Bolshevism itself, but, Merleau-Ponty suggests, ultimately in Marx's own realism. That blend of extreme objectivism and subjectivism that defined Bolshevism was already in Marx when he admits that revolution is present before it is recognized.
So the seeds were there in Marx.
Merleau-Ponty suggests so. This idea of a revolution that can be forced or anticipated before its objective conditions are ripe, a cross-growth rather than a natural maturation, profoundly challenges the notion that the revolution is a truly universal and inevitable outcome. It introduces this powerful, disturbing element of voluntarism and contingency right into the heart of supposedly historical materialism.
So if the revolution is a cross-growth, a premature forcing of history, it loses its claim to being this objective, destined outcome. And what happens when such a revolution, born from this forced negativity, tries to establish itself as a lasting regime? How does that play out?
That's where Merleau-Ponty highlights a crucial dynamic. A revolution, once established, must exist positively. It cannot remain a pure negation indefinitely.
It has to build something.
Right. The ideal of permanent revolution, which implies this continuous self-critical movement, becomes a myth when it hardens into a static regime. Its revolutionary flow, when established as an institution, is no longer driven by the masses, but represented by bureaucrats who inevitably return to the positive, asserting themselves in the name of positivity and stability.
And this leads to?
This leads directly to Merleau-Ponty's striking, memorable insight. Revolutions are true as movements and false as regimes.
There it is again. True as movements, false as regimes.
Exactly. The historical movement, he argues, betrays and disfigures itself in the very act of accomplishing itself as an institution. The purity of the revolutionary moment, that absolute negation of the old order, simply cannot survive its own success.
Why not?
Because the very nature of revolution is to believe itself absolute, right? Total, final. Yet it can't be absolute precisely because it believes itself to be so. You don't kill people and overturn society for relative progress. Revolutionaries act with an absolute conviction in a total transformation.
The stakes demand absolutes.
Yes. Yet any established revolutionary power, by its very nature, cannot remain a pure, dynamic negation without dissolving into chaos. It must establish new forms, new institutions, new power structures, and in doing so, it inevitably loses the radical, open-ended spirit of the movement that brought it into being. The regime betrays the movement.
It's a tragic cycle.
It seems so. And this reveals the deep equivocalness of revolutionary thought itself. It simultaneously views revolution as the fruit of history, arising from objective conditions, and as an internal mechanism or subjective will where men make their history through sheer force. Marxism, Merleau-Ponty finds, juxtaposes these two perspectives without ever truly reconciling them.
Leaving an unresolved tension.
A profound, unresolved tension that ultimately contributes to the revolutionary project's internal contradictions and the tragic failure of its aspirations. And the consequence is stark. One cannot simply try Marx all over again if his philosophy is involved in this failure. The philosophical roots of the problem, Merleau-Ponty suggests, are just too deep.
Okay, now, turning to Jean-Paul Sartre, we see another attempt to grapple with communism, but from a very different angle, wouldn't you say? Almost hyper-subjective. He seems to move away from the historical materialism we've been discussing and towards a philosophy of, well, pure action.
That's a very good way to put it. Merleau-Ponty characterizes Sartre's communism precisely as ultra-Bolshevism, a philosophy of pure action.
Ultra-Bolshevism, what does that entail?
For Sartre, communist action isn't something that arises from deep historical conditions or a careful analysis of the proletariat's material situation. Not really. Instead, it's this radical reply of a will that has no basis in things to the trap of events.
A pure act of will against circumstance.
Exactly. The militants, the party, even the class itself, in this view, don't come from some discernible historical past. They are what they make themselves in the present moment through sheer, unadulterated will.
So history doesn't matter as much.
It's downplayed significantly. The militant, in Sartre's framework, does not decide to act. He acts. He is action, subject of history. Merleau-Ponty compares this to Kant's moral subject, believing in God. It's a gratuitous, almost defiant affirmation of value that postulates what is necessary in being, regardless of empirical evidence. There's a profound voluntarism at play here, a belief in the absolute power of individual and collective will.
Okay. And how does this connect to facts, to reality?
Well, Sartre's approach is characterized by a radical rejection of historical mediation. He dismisses both communism and anti-communism when you look at them in the realm of objective facts. He argues there is no rigorous confrontation of idea and fact, and no verifiable way of establishing if an idea is truly realized in fact.
So you can't test the ideas against reality.
But not easily. For him, facts are always circumvented by decisions, giving no means of appeal. The probable, the messy, contingent realm of empirical reality is rejected in favor of pure, lightning-quick decisions made against all facts.
Wow. Decide against the facts.
That's the implication. Truth in politics isn't something discovered in history or mediated by empirical reality, but something created by sheer will. And this, Merleau-Ponty argues, allows Sartre's idea of the party to basically cover any fact, because it's always seen as the expression of the existing proletariat, and the party's action at any given moment becomes the entire existence of the proletariat.
So for Sartre, it really sounds like he's saying that truth in politics isn't something we uncover in the world, but something we forge through our own will. This seems to detach the party almost completely from any real existing proletariat, making the proletariat more like an abstract concept, an idea in the minds of the leaders.
Precisely. The proletariat in Sartre's ultra-Bolshevik framework becomes an idea of the leaders, a category delegated to represent humanity in Sartre's thought. It doesn't exist as a historical reality with advances, peaks, declines, or variable historical weight.
It just is or isn't.
Right. It exists immediately through obedience, and it ceases to exist immediately through disobedience. It's untouchable, Merleau-Ponty argues, because it exists only in the pure action of the party, and that action, in turn, ultimately exists only in Sartre's own thought.
That sounds circular.
It is quite circular, and this view demands that the worker needs to believe that there is a truth. Since he cannot work it out alone, he must be able to trust his class leaders profoundly enough to believe he is getting the truth from them.
So, blind faith in the leadership.
It makes the party's authority absolute, almost divine. Merleau-Ponty calls it a purity of the transcendental subject forcefully incorporated into the world. It's a very top-down, unquestioning faith.
And what does this do to Sartre's view of society in general?
Well, it leads to what Merleau-Ponty calls Sartre's generalized suspicion. For him, there are only scoundrels, not merely fools or people making mistakes. History, except for what is created by the potential public or the gaze of the least favored, is considered waste.
Everyone else is suspect.
Pretty much. This means that the social, the collective dimension of human existence only enters Sartre's philosophy, which is deeply rooted in the cogito, right? That I think, therefore I am placing individual consciousness at the absolute center. It only enters by way of the alter ego, the other. It is never perceived or lived by man except as incompleteness and oppression or in the obscurity of action.
So the social is inherently negative.
It's portrayed that way. The social, in this perspective, isn't an inherent aspect of human being, but an external force, an imposition from the other that must be negated or overcome through pure, unadulterated action. It's a highly individualistic, almost solipsistic lens through which to view collective political struggle.
That makes the social realm sound almost inherently hostile, a source of oppression rather than connection. And if action is this pure, unmediated will, what does that imply for the role of violence in Sartre's philosophy? It sounds like it could justify quite a bit.
Merleau-Ponty meticulously analyzes Sartre's embrace of violence, arguing it stems directly from his immediate, almost brutal unification of freedom and impotence, past and future, self and other, in a direct negation.
How does that work?
When negativity descends into the world and takes possession of it by force, when it wants to become history immediately, everything that opposes it appears as negation and can be put pell-mell in the same bag.
Lumping all opposition together.
Exactly. This creates short circuits, bypassing any complex historical mediations or nuanced understanding of social relations. It goes directly from freedom to the party without any intermediate steps or critical reflection.
Straight from the individual will to the party's action.
Right. And Merleau-Ponty seriously questions whether pure violence or pure action truly exists in the real world. Pure action, once it's applied in the messy, contingent world, is immediately immersed in a realm of probable relations and must inevitably accept mediations.
It gets complicated immediately.
Right. It becomes mere inner life, a private philosophical stance, unless it tells us how to change the world, not just that we should. Without these mediations, without engagement with the concrete realities of history and social relations, Sartre's philosophy, Merleau-Ponty argues, remains an abstract call to arms, detached from the very world it claims to transform.
So ultimately, how far is Sartre from Marx in this view?
Merleau-Ponty concludes he's far away from Marx precisely because he denies the coming to be of meaning in institutions. For Marx, remember, history was this mixed milieu, neither merely things nor persons, where intentions get absorbed and transformed, sometimes decaying, sometimes reborn, often in unforeseen ways.
A messy process.
Very messy. For Sartre, it's much more black and white. Criminal intentions or virtuous intentions, and clear-cut acts of acceptance or rejection. He effectively disavows historical matter, of class as the measure of action, and of revolution as truth. Sartre's philosophy, by divorcing action from verifiable historical conditions and grounding it in pure will, effectively strips communism of its materialist and dialectical foundations, reducing it to an almost mystical act of faith and subjective decision. It's a powerful philosophy, no doubt, but ultimately, for Merleau-Ponty, a deeply problematic adventure of the dialectic.
Okay, so after this really rigorous journey through all these different adventures of the dialectic, I mean, from Hegel's grand system to Marx's revolutionary critique, Weber's heroic liberalism, Lukacs' self-critical Western Marxism, then Lenin's orthodoxy, Trotsky's permanent revolution, and finally Sartre's ultra-Bolshevism. What is Merleau-Ponty's ultimate take? How does he redefine this fundamental concept, the dialectic, and what does it mean for our understanding of history and political action today?
Right. After navigating all that, Merleau-Ponty's ultimate conclusion is, I think, profoundly insightful and actually offers a way forward, not just a critique. He explicitly states, dialectic is not the idea of a reciprocal action, nor that of the solidarity of opposites and of their sublation.
So it's not just those mechanisms, thesis, antithesis, etc.
Those, he says, are just consequences or aspects. Instead, dialectic must be grasped in our experience at the junction of a subject of being and of other subjects. It's a messy, lived reality.
Where we meet the world and each other.
Exactly. It's not a closed system with a predetermined path, but a thought with several centers and several points of entry, which needs time to explore them all. It is a permanent interrogation, a kind of genealogy of truth that intensifies questioning rather than ending it.
So the dialectic becomes a question, not an answer.
Precisely. This conception of history as a history reality means it's a judge of our thoughts, constantly challenging our assumptions, but it's also itself an advent of consciousness, requiring our active, engaged presence rather than passive obedience to some pre-written script.
That makes perfect sense. It turns the dialectic from a rigid formula into an active, ongoing process of questioning and engagement. And this, I imagine, is where his famous statement, the one you mentioned earlier, revolutions are true as movements and false as regimes, truly resonates. It captures the inherent paradox you've been highlighting throughout our discussion.
Exactly. That is a core, almost haunting idea for Merleau-Ponty. He says revolutions degenerate precisely because as established regimes, they can never be what they were as movements.
The institution corrupts the ideal.
In becoming an institution, the historical movement is no longer itself. It betrays and disfigures itself in accomplishing itself. The very nature of revolution, he argues, is to believe itself absolute, total, and final, yet not be absolute precisely because it believes itself to be so.
The belief in being absolute prevents it from being absolute.
Yes. Because you don't sacrifice lives and commit to radical change for just relative progress. Revolutionaries act with an absolute conviction in a total transformation. Yet, any established revolutionary power, by its very nature, cannot remain a pure dynamic negation without dissolving into chaos. It has to establish new forms, new institutions, new power structures, and in doing so, it inevitably loses the radical, open-ended spirit of the movement that brought it into being. The movement's purity is lost in the regime's necessary compromises and solidifications.
Okay.
And this, Merleau-Ponty points out, reveals the equivocalness of revolutionary thought itself. It simultaneously views revolution as the fruit of history, arising from objective, mature conditions, and as an internal mechanism or subjective will where men make their history through sheer force. Marxism, Merleau-Ponty finds, constantly juxtaposes these two perspectives without ever truly reconciling them.
An unresolved tension at its heart.
Exactly, leading to a profound unresolved tension that ultimately contributes to the revolutionary project's internal contradictions and the tragic failure of its grand aspirations.
So if these grand revolutionary projects, even the ones rooted in supposedly objective historical forces, are inherently doomed to this cycle of betrayal and disillusionment, what's left? Does Merleau-Ponty just leave us in a state of, I don't know, cynical resignation?
Yeah.
Or does he point towards a different path?
No, definitely not resignation. He points towards a different, much more nuanced path. He calls for a non-communist left.
A non-communist left. What does that look like?
This isn't about giving up. It's about a profound intellectual and political reorientation. He argues that we must renounce the proletariat as the necessary vehicle for universal emancipation.
Not abandon the working class, but...
Not abandon them, no, but abandon the idea that they are the sole predetermined agent of universal liberation. Historical experience has shown that relying on one class this way leads to the very dogmatism and betrayal we've discussed. Instead, he says, we must look at social relations in their totality, in all their intricate complexity, rather than solely focusing on the production process as the single determining factor.
Broaden the focus beyond just economics.
Yes. And he hints at a new definition of man centered on culture, a shared historical situation, encompassing our intersubjective relationships to the present and past, to our institutions, our values, our language. This means rejecting the idea of one single determining factor and embracing man's total human character, recognizing his intersubjective relationship not only to his present lived reality, but also to other men in other ages. It's a broader, richer understanding of what makes us human.
Okay, so what does this non-communist left do?
It's called to have a positive politics, to pose and resolve concrete problems instead of living with one eye fixed on the USSR and the other on the United States, which was, of course, the Cold War dilemma of his time.
And for us today?
For us today, it means looking squarely at our own problems, our own systems, rather than constantly comparing ourselves to some ideal state or demonizing external enemies. It means actively accepting the right to strike and political liberties, genuinely understanding and even legitimizing adversaries as fellow citizens with different perspectives, and above all, being rigorously willing to self-criticize.
Self-criticism again. Crucial.
Absolutely. This path involves conscious action which will confront itself with the judgment of an opposition. It accepts the limitations of parliamentary action, not as an end in itself, but as a crucial guarantor of a minimum of opposition and of truth, while also critically denouncing parliamentary mystification when it occurs.
So, working within the system, but critically.
Exactly. It's about seeing institutions as instruments, not sacred laws, and continually analyzing, criticizing, and transforming them. It means choosing clarity and verifiable progress over utopian absolutes and embracing the ongoing, never-ending task of shaping history without the pretense of absolute knowledge. It's a call for a profound philosophical engagement with the ambiguity of our historical situation, a continuous effort of enlightenment that marries the social problem with the unwavering pursuit of freedom.
So what Merleau-Ponty is really asking us to do then is to hold on to both ends of the chain, to acknowledge the urgency of the social problem, the profound injustices, and to fiercely guard human freedom and the possibility of genuine self-critical dialogue. It's a continuous, often difficult effort of enlightenment, an ongoing task to shape history, rather than waiting for some predetermined outcome or relying on a blind, voluntarist will. It means engaging with ambiguity head-on, rather than seeking simplistic answers.
Exactly. It means accepting that political freedom isn't necessarily just a defense of capitalism in its current form, but also not believing that capitalist institutions are the only mechanisms of exploitation. It's about seeing all institutions as instruments, not sacred laws, and continually analyzing, criticizing, and transforming them to better serve human flourishing. It means choosing clarity, verifiable progress, and concrete action over utopian absolutes and dogmatic pronouncements. It's an approach that values knowledge, labor, criticism, and our complete presence in shaping the world, rather than passively waiting for a predetermined outcome or relying on a blind will. It calls for a profound philosophical engagement with the ambiguity of our historical situation, acknowledging that tension between movement and regime, and embracing the unending adventure of human freedom. So, if Merleau-Ponty's core insight really is that revolutions are true as movements and false as regimes, what does this actually imply for our own efforts to bring about change in the world today? Are we just condemned to this endless cycle of creating institutions that inevitably betray their initial revolutionary spirit?
That's a sobering thought.
It is. Or is there perhaps a way to foster continuous, self-critical movements that somehow manage to avoid hardening into rigid regimes? A way to acknowledge and work with that inherent paradox of transforming the world rather than being destroyed by it?
Merleau-Ponty asks us really to consider whether we can engage with the deep challenges of our social realm without either the pretense of having absolute pre-written historical solutions or falling into the paralysis of pure relativism where nothing seems possible. It pushes you, the listener, to actively inspect the dice of history, as it were, to seek knowledge, to labor, to criticize, and to bring your complete conscious presence into shaping the world, rather than just waiting for a predetermined outcome or relying on a blind will. It's a profound question, really, about the nature of truth, action, and the unending adventure of human freedom in a world that stubbornly resists easy